Presumptive legislation was only put in place on the basis there was an underpinning scientific evidence. In other words, there's a leap that's taken, and that is there's a legal presumption. Now that has a meaning. Legal presumption means that you can actually come to a conclusion if there's evidence underpinning enough to be able to make a determination. So when we talk about presumptive laws, we actually have presumptive laws that are based on a legal presumption. As you all know, it was, or up until 2011, we all had members that were either actually contracted cancer or passed from cancer, but the normal course of legislation for workers' compensation failed us. And that is, normal system works on causation and effect. That is, firefighter goes in the building, roof collapses, breaks a limb, causation roof collapse, leg breaks, causation effect, compensation made out. But in relation to our cancer-related illness, you all know from the Senate inquiry, and we've got former Senator Marshall here who chaired that inquiry, and I've just come back from Parliament speaking to Adam Banks, who put the legislation through, and that is that we were unable to get compensation for our members, not to put money in their pocket, but to enable them to pay for very expensive treatment, concentrate on getting well as provide for their family. And that's what presumptive laws are all about. And after the Senate inquiry, we brought out international experts and we put in place a system, a structure, that is not new legislation, but an amendment to the normal compensation systems, a special section for firefighters because it was a special case. And that is, there is volumes, and absolute volumes of evidence, scientific evidence, about the causation of cancer as the occupation of firefighting as a result of those unavoidable risks that we take, and that is going into the burning buildings and the absorption of that material into your skin. And that scientific evidence was able to underpin a legal presumption that if you got one of those type of cancers in those scientific evidence, then compensation would automatically flow. But there is a catch, and that is that it is rebuttable. And that is to give certainty to the insurer and the employer. They are able to rebut a claim if there is not the basis for a legal presumption. In other words, if there is no evidence. And what we're actually seeing here is the evolution of our scheme from other occupations, including volunteers, who believe they want to be entitled to these unique circumstances. Unfortunately, one of the major issues in the Senate inquiry was simply this, that it was not going to pass the legislative processes because the worry of flow-on, the worry of the cost of the scheme and the integrity of the scheme. And after demonstrating that it was only going to be applicable to career firefighters because there was scientific evidence that underpin it, and that there would be no flow-on effect because of the sections that Greg pointed out, that is, substantial portion of the work is firefighting, that they knew there was going to be no flow-on effect. On that basis, it passed. Then we've seen it actually rolled out around the country. 2011 was federal firefighters, 2013 Tasmania, and it went around the country. Virtually the same model. It was important to have the same model because we needed the same protections. And then we've seen the evolution over in Tasmania where they wanted to include volunteers, and the then minister over there put in a dual system that worked on contacts, and that is for a volunteer firefighter, they had to actually demonstrate a number of contacts. Now, why did he do that? There is no scientific evidence that supports a presumption, a legal presumption for compensation for volunteers. In fact, it's the opposite. The largest study in relation to occupational cancer for volunteers is the Monash University report. And its conclusion is there is no elevated risk of cancer for volunteers, other than skin cancer for older volunteers. So there's no legal presumption able to be made out. So what happens is, then it is rebutted. Because if you're an insurer or alternatively employer, and a volunteer makes a claim under our normal scheme, they will simply say, Monash University found no elevated risk, claim denied, and you're back to wherever you were, and that is back to litigation. And that's the very thing the Senate was worried about. never-ending litigation and the cost of the scheme. So they come up with a two-tier model. And the two-tier model is that automatically for career firefighters, the evidence is there is a legal presumption based on science. For volunteers, there is no legal presumption able to be made out. In fact, it's the opposite because of Monash University report, which is the authority to report. But because of the political situation, to give effect to the political promises by politicians, we put in a dual system. And the dual system was one where there was an expert panel. And that expert panel sat below the system for career firefighters, and it looked at each claim by volunteers, and if they were able to demonstrate they had attended fires, then that panel could override the legal presumption and award the compensation without impacting on our scheme. What you're seeing here is not just up here in the ACT, and I'll put you on notice, all of yous around the country, you're going to see other occupations want to opt into your scheme. Up here, I went and seen the senator who's got the balance of power, and we spoke to his advisor, and they didn't understand presumptive laws. And on the face value, they think they're actually giving a benefit to the volunteers up here by including them in your scheme and lowering the threshold by removing the substantial proportion. But what they're doing is it's a false premise because there is no legal presumption. As soon as you put them into the scheme, some smart lawyer is going to pull out Monash and say, no evidence, claim denied, rejected, back to litigation. Fortunately, we were able to get through to the advisor as to it was ill-conceived just to simply put him into the ACT scheme or the Commonwealth Comcare scheme and then lower the threshold, because what you're doing is you're rolling the dice. And you're rolling the dice on the basis that some lawyer may or may not pick up the fact that Monash University says no legal presumption. So we've suggested to this senator advisor that the model in Queensland, the model in Victoria of the expert committee is the way to go. If you're talking about equity, that gives equity. Because 9 out of 10 claims of volunteers are accepted through that expert committee because it doesn't rely on the legal presumption. It's an assessment made of a committee. Now in Victoria, they put mechanics into our scheme and they removed the word firefighter and put the word persons. Because other people on face value think this is a wonderful scheme we want to give to our members. But what they don't understand, the first time there's going to be a claim for a mechanic, what you're going to see is there's no scientific evidence, absolutely not one study. You're going to see a rebuttal and you're going to see litigation, the very thing we try to get away from. So Greg's on the money, like he always is, and that is he's advocated the system of the dual system, that is the committee underpinning the presumption legislation for career firefighters, and that's where we need to go. If you think this battle is confined to Comcare, think again. Politicians like to deal out favours, and they think it's a good thing to deal out favours to volunteers or mechanics or whatever union they may be factionally aligned with, and that's what happened in Victoria. The problem is, if that keeps going, presumptive laws here in Australia have limited tenure. So it's incumbent upon all of us to do what we can. So I've just been up to Parliament, explained the system. As a result of that, under Greg's leadership, we now actually have a Zoom meeting with the foremost expert, being Alex Forrest, with this senator that holds the balance of power and his advisors to explain about presumptive laws, how it works on a legal presumption, but as well as the fact that this senator is very interested in gender-based cancer. Now, if he wants to be the leader and put that up there, well, let's help him do it as long as he puts a system that provides real equity, and that is a dual system. Because if you put volunteers into the Comcare scheme as it is and lower the threshold, I can guarantee you what you're going to see is the slow demise of this scheme. It'll end up in litigation, or alternatively, the floodgates, as was foreshadowed in the Senate inquiry, will be open. Now, Greg's got a strategy, but let me tell you this very clearly. It is not confined to Comcare. It's happened in Victoria. And more importantly, as I see it go around the country, it's going to happen in your state as well, because they don't understand the technicalities of what presumptive laws are. Sure, we won the battle in 2011, but now in 2022, we're on the verge of losing the battle because it's being extended to people who are not entitled. And that means the viability and financial viability and integrity of the scheme will be brought into question. So we've got a bit of work to do, and if we talk about nationally, we got it here in Canberra for Comcare, we rolled it out in Tassie, Western Australia, then it went to Queensland and wherever else, South Australia, and it went around the country, and Victoria was last. Now we have to campaign to maintain it, and here the battle starts. Victoria, we are absolutely at war with the government, a government that we actually are very comfortable with. Why? Because they've changed the very laws that protect our members who die, our members who combat cancer, and the ones that actually provide for their family. So the battle's not confined to Victoria or up here. It is a national battle, and we're very lucky to have Alex Forrest take time out of his holiday to be briefing the Senator with the balance of power this afternoon under Greg's leadership. We've actually shored that up with the Greens, with Adam Ban, who put the legislation in the first place in 2011, and political action is what this is all about. But if we take our eye off the ball, the thin edge of the wedge will mean the short-term to long-term viability of the scheme is finished. Be under no illusion. Because the costs will go up through litigation from the rebuttal, or alternatively claims will be made to people who are not deserving. Now that may sound a bit harsh, but firefighting is the most studied occupation. There is study after study that confirms our members die in protecting the public. There is no study that actually says that about volunteer firefighters. In fact, the only study says there's no elevated risk. And there is certainly no study for mechanics. But what you're seeing is politicians dealing out factional favours to other unions at our expense. So the line's in the sand. We've got great leadership up here, but it's incumbent upon all of you, because if it happens up here, it's happened in Victoria, it's only a matter of time that it will spread.